Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. A new report released by the Uyghur Human Rights Project called Sacred Rights to Files details some of the increased religious repression that the Chinese authorities have subjected the Uyghurs to. The Uyghurs are an ethnic minority that live in northwestern Xinjiang province in China. Here today to talk about that issue, we have Aleem Saitov. He's the director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Aleem, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
So, Aleem, in your report, you mentioned the religious affairs regulations that came into effect in 2005. Can you give me an example of what that controls?
This controls all aspects of Uyghur religious beliefs and practices, including who can attend a mosque, who cannot. For example, Uyghur women and minors are not allowed to enter mosques. Who have scarves or veils, they're not allowed to enter any kind of public buildings such as hospitals, libraries, or any places. Uyghur men who have beards have to shave, and regardless, and also during the month of Holy Ramadan, and Uyghurs are not allowed to fast. It is actually a month of fasting in Islam. That's one of the duties being a Muslim, that you should fast during that month. But the Chinese government doesn't allow Uyghur cadres, workers, students and teachers, all who are employed by the state, to fast, and also force Uyghur restaurants to open restaurants during the month.
So why do they say people aren't allowed to fast?
Well, that's a nature of the Chinese intrusion into the very private areas of Uyghur religious practice. The reason is the Chinese government simply does not want the Uyghurs to continue their religious practice and tradition. Basically want to force the Uyghurs to become, at the end of the day, atheists. So that's why their policies are extremely intrusive and aggressive.
What kind of struck me in the report were a lot of the things that you mentioned. You know, it's not just religious, but also it seems kind of things like music that could be also, cultural.
Yes, the Uyghur people are obviously Muslims, but we have our own music and songs, our own traditions. We accepted Islam as part of our tradition. We mixed with our previous traditions. So a lot of things really cultural that the Uyghur people hold dear to. That's part of their identity. But the Chinese policies are aimed at eradicating not just practices, religious practices and beliefs, but also eradicate Uyghur people's traditional practices and also the identity. For example, Uyghur language is under attack, in addition to a number of Uyghur expressions, whether Uyghur songs or music or dances. And so the Chinese government has progressively narrowed the definition of Uyghur religious freedom and Uyghur religious practices, as well as what constitute Uyghur traditions. Any attempt by the Uyghurs to assert their unique and indigenous Uyghur identity is perceived by the state as the promotion of separatism, and that's also under attack.
So a lot of what you're talking about, in the West, we're not as familiar with the situation of the Uyghur people, but it seems like a lot of what you're talking about is familiar to many people because it seems similar to what's happening to Tibetans. Would you say that's the case?
Yes, our situation is very similar to the situation of the Tibetans. They're our neighbors, and they happen to believe in Buddhism, and we happen to believe in Islam. And the restrictions imposed by the Chinese government in Tibet is very much the same. Their religious beliefs and practices are also under heavy attack by the Chinese authorities, and the international community is very well aware of the situation of Tibet. But whereas in our situation we are Muslims, and after 9/11, the Chinese government took advantage of the global war on terror and overnight described itself as a victim of terrorism, and also began to label Uyghur activists who are not happy with China's heavy-handed policies in our homeland as terrorist separatists and religious extremists, and began to justify its heavy-handed crackdown. Since then, up until now, the Chinese government's rhetoric against Uyghurs is basically saying China is against three evil forces of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. All three labels apply almost specifically on the Uyghurs.
So you mentioned
Muslims.
You mentioned the issue of terrorism and how they've kind of framed this as a discussion of like fighting terrorism. Do you think that's affected the perception of what's happening in Xinjiang for people in the West?
That is, to some extent, yes. In the early days of global war on terrorism, China was able to successfully, in a way, demonize the Uyghur people's legitimate demands as a terrorism. At the time, of course, the Western governments were not very sure of what kind of alleged threat the Chinese government was facing. But today, most Western governments know the Chinese government has not produced any kind of substantive evidence of so-called Uyghur terrorism, so the Western governments are extremely skeptical. That's why whenever something happens in our homeland, then immediately the Chinese government jumps into a conclusion stating that the acts were, involve Uyghurs were terrorism. But the Western governments usually do not support the Chinese government's view on this, which makes China very unhappy and claims that the Western governments have a double standard, which is not true.
So I want to ask about some the recent stabbings that happened in Xinjiang a couple weeks ago, because it kind of directly ties to the point you were last making. When the news first came out that 21 people were killed, it was framed as a terror attack, but then later it seems like that wasn't the case.
Yes, not really, because as we know, the Chinese government in China controls all media in China, and also Chinese government control the crime scene and alleged evidence. So the Chinese government usually put out one version of what happened in its national interest, and it does not allow whether UN or US or to have an independent and transparent investigation of the alleged violence that took place, and also allow Western journalists stationed in Beijing or other places to come and investigate what truly transpired. So that's why the Western governments and media do not believe. And also, according to the information from the Uyghur eyewitnesses and the locals there, the event turned out to be contradicts the Chinese government's official version of what happened. So again, every time something happens like that, the Chinese government blames Uyghurs as terrorists and use that as another justification to launch heavy-handed strike-hard campaigns or attacks on the Uyghur people. But again, the Western governments and media do not accept the Chinese government's version of what transpired.
Now, you mentioned the Western reporters, reporters from Western news organizations not being able to go to Xinjiang to report on, what really happened in these incidents. Now, famously, after the protests and demonstrations there in 2009, the entire region was put on lockdown, and even the internet was shut off in Xinjiang. What is the information, flow of information like there today?
Yeah, the flow of information from East Turkestan or even Tibet is extremely limited because the Chinese government has issued information blackout from both regions. Because the Chinese government is really afraid that if the information from East Turkestan and Tibet come out, it will show the real nature of Chinese rule in both regions. So that's why the Chinese government punishes Uyghurs and Tibetans who post pictures or videos on YouTube or other Chinese websites, or who dares to speak out against Chinese atrocities in both of the regions. And that's why also Chinese government, after July 5th of 2009, cut both internet and telephone communications in East Turkestan for 10 months. That's actually unprecedented in world history. Now we see the revolution in Syria. We witnessed, in addition to Syria and also in Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries, we did not see such information blackout, such as cutting off both internet and telephone for nearly a year. So we know from this how afraid the Chinese government is because of what happened in both Tibet and East Turkestan, and if the international community really finds out the nature of Chinese rule in both regions. That's why the punishment against Uyghurs and Tibetans who speak out, and also foreign journalists who dare to venture into both regions to report on the violence they're also usually arrested and evicted immediately. In the case of Maralbishi, just soon after the violence of April 22nd in Kashgar, the BBC was able to send one reporter undercover to try to report and speak to local Uyghurs. But the Chinese police rounded up the reporters, immediately sent them back to Beijing.
Has this kind of strategy been successful for Beijing? The information control, the increased kind of, you say, criminalization of religious belief, are they achieving their goal, do you feel?
No, actually, not really. It's in the opposite direction. The more the Chinese government aggressively cracked down in East Turkestan and Tibet, the more resistance garnered, by the Chinese policies. So both Uyghurs and Tibetans, they're extremely resistant to Chinese government's rule. Basically, the Chinese government has failed to win the hearts, minds of the Uyghurs and Tibetans as two big populations in what is now western part of China. And their policies are backfiring. We see from time to time violence erupts in both Tibet and East Turkestan. These are indications that the failure of Chinese policies in both regions. Unless until China changes such heavy-handed repressive policies, things will not be stable in both regions.
What do you see as the future being in that region?
As long as China continues such repressive policies, I see a very dark future for both East Turkestan and Tibet. It's actually in the best interest of China to change its heavy-handed approach to both regions, because these policies have really failed since 1949 and are not producing any kind of good results. Chinese policies are the key reasons to destabilize really both East Turkestan and Tibet, not the Uyghurs and Tibetans, or so-called three evil forces.
Okay, thank you, Aleem, so much for joining us today to talk about this issue.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. For more on this and other issues in China, join us at ndnews.tv.